Hey Reluctant Preppers, this is showing you just how easy it is to purchase silver without paying any premium over spot price. You just go to sdbullion.com/rp, scroll down and enter the special code to get silver without any premium, and they'll mail it to your mailbox, discreetly packaged. Inside you'll find a beautiful 10-ounce bar of fine silver, and you are able to purchase that and have it and add it to your stack and your collection without paying any premium. And you're supporting Reluctant Preppers along the way. Thanks.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. This returning guest has spoken with us in the past on such topics as electromagnetic pulses, EMPs, and also some of the optimizations we need to do to make sure we're prioritizing the most important things first in our preparedness list and preparing for disaster scenarios that could come from natural disasters or even geopolitical conflagrations. He is Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, PhD. He's with us again. He's the founder of disasterprepare.com and author of numerous books about both preparedness in a scholarly manner and a very practical guides, handbook for disaster preparedness for families, and so on, in multiple editions, as well as fictional accounts of aftermath of collapse. He's with us again here on Reluctant Preppers to talk to us about protecting ourselves in ways that might not come to mind when we think about self-defense or home defense. This is self-defense insurance, and how do we protect ourselves from the legal and litigious considerations around keeping ourselves and our families safe. Dr. Bradley, thank you for joining us again here on Reluctant Preppers.
Sure, thank you for having me on.
We were wanting to talk with you about this topic, and it's one that you've done research on and written about recently. We had recently Bo Dobozinski, the director of training from Sealed Mindset, which is a Navy SEAL-founded tactical training institute in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and he was talking to us about the fact that we live in a highly litigious society, and that people when they think about protecting themselves, they often think about some perpetrator who's going to do them harm in either public setting or in their home. But he said the one thing that people don't often do an equal amount of preparation for is keeping their liberty safe and protected, and their fortune safe and protected in the event of something gone wrong. And that with the right education, the right preparation, and the right insurance steps, we can make wiser choices in our words, our actions, and in maybe even actual insurance that we need to do to protect ourselves from more than just a perpetrator. So if you could take us through the considerations that are around that, we'd sure appreciate it.
Sure, yeah. So I guess I start the same place your other guest did, which is really just to sort of ask the question, is this worth something bothering over? And I must confess, until this year, I did not have self-defense insurance, and so either I didn't know enough about it, or I had internally concluded that it wasn't important enough to pay out my hard-earned money for. So, but just recently, I decided to really look into that a little bit further. I carry a concealed firearm, like a lot of people, probably a lot of your listeners do, almost everywhere I go. The only exception really is when I go to work. I work on a federal base, so I can't carry one there. But so I started really thinking through, well, what happens if I'm at the ATM or out at Subway or wherever, and something happens, God forbid something happens, that I find myself in a situation where I have to defend myself or my family. I'm not sure that I really thought through the sequence of events that might happen and how that might affect me. I mean, I'm confident I wouldn't draw a firearm and shoot someone unless I felt like I was threatened or someone around me was threatened. But that might not be enough. It certainly might not be enough in the eyes of the officers arriving on scene, and I might end up being charged with a crime, which could ruin me in lots of different ways. I would have to find an attorney. I would have to have all of that stress and costs associated with that. And then later, even if I were found innocent, I might be sued in civil court, which could go on for years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more. So I really started thinking about that, and I started asking myself, well, you're going to carry this firearm day in and day out, and it's really, important to me to be able to defend my life and liberty. but I also don't want to have sort of that weight on my shoulders of worrying over if this does happen. No matter what happens to me from that point forward, I'm going to be really paying a penalty. So I looked into this self-defense insurance, and I learned a lot, and I'd like to share some with you and your audience. And everybody can draw their own conclusions. I think it's important that each person asks themselves, is this something that's important to me and worth my money? And then they do their own research and pick the company that they think helps them best. I will say this, that I have no vested interest whatsoever in any of these companies offering this insurance. So I'll give you my straight scoop on all of them. I don't get anything from anybody, just in case anybody listening wonders about that.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify that for our audience, because sometimes people can assume that anybody that gets interviewed is automatically selling something, and in this case, you're giving us information from your research, and we appreciate that. And you're not here to sell insurance; you're here to share information you've gained, and we can sure benefit from it. So, please tell us what's a kind of a scenario that comes to mind when you're thinking of a case where suddenly a situation turned bad could become a big legal nightmare, in addition to being what was a physically scary situation.
Yeah, well, I can share an actual experience I had a number of years ago. I didn't actually carry a firearm daily at that time. I just gotten out of the Army, and I was approached by three men armed. One had a knife as I was getting in my car, and it just so happened, the fate of God smiling on me, I guess, that I had just come from shooting. I used to go shooting outdoors at this little outdoor range, and so I had a firearm there in the seat with me, right next to me. And it actually wasn't loaded, but they didn't know that, of course. And everything happened very, very quickly. And so I spun around, still half sitting in the car with a firearm in my hand. And, it drew the reaction you might expect. Three people stopped in their tracks, and while they shouted profanities and so forth, they didn't come any closer, and it might well have saved my life that day. And so they, got in their cars and drove off and screamed and hollered the way crazy people do. And I was pretty upset about it. I felt like, one thing, the gun wasn't loaded, which really bothered me more than anything else. But so I drove to a local police station, and because I didn't really know how to protect myself. I didn't have an attorney. I didn't know what I should do. Had I committed a crime? I wasn't really sure. And I went to a police station and reported the incident and described what happened. And the officer at that time took my statement and said, well, you did the right thing coming here. It shows the right intentions. And he said they actually have a year, in that state at least, they had a year to come and file charges, saying that basically I'd brandished a firearm on them. But he said the fact that you came here and made the statement, they would very likely, their scenario would not be believed and so forth. So it all worked out fine. I never ended up having to shoot anybody, but that's sort of an example of just like, I'm coming out of Kmart, getting in my car, and for no good reason, somebody decides maybe they're going to rob me, maybe they're going to take my car, I don't know. Then my whole life sort of could have changed in that instant. And what if the firearm had been loaded, and what if one of them hadn't stopped? That all plays through my mind.
Of course.
So I think those scenarios can happen to anybody at any time, right? And it's just a roll of the dice when it might happen to someone.
And this is something that came up time and time again in our concealed carry class that my wife and I attended and went through. And the thing is, assuming, hey, I know I'm just trying to do my own private business as a citizen, and if I'm carrying and somebody comes to try to do me harm, and I'm afraid for my life or for serious harm, or for me, a loved one, and I use a weapon, there's this kind of commonsensical assumption that people might make that, well, because I was well-intended and I was in the right to defend myself, doesn't have the right to protect myself, then therefore they were the bad guy, I was the good guy, so it won't be a problem, right? And we were told, I think that's probably what some of your research showed you, is that's not always the case.
Right. No, that's absolutely true. And you can find all kind of horror stories out there about, appear to be good, law-abiding, honest people who get frightened, who get in a situation where they feel like their life is threatened, and they end up shooting someone. In any normal, rational person's mind, especially a fellow gun owner, you would think, well, yeah, of course they shot that person. Of course they were trying to defend themselves. But, I once heard it said that any legal case can be lost and any legal case can be won. And I really believe that's true. And so even if a person is, by most accounts, everybody would say, yeah, he had the right to do that, there's always a story that can be told. There's always a way things can be looked at in some specific light where, you get the wrong people on a jury or the wrong attorneys going after you, where all of a sudden you can be made to look like a bad guy. Maybe the trigger pull on your gun had been modified. Oh, clearly he was looking to, to be able to shoot someone, so he had made these modifications to his gun to make it more lethal, and on it goes, right? So I think having, at least the understanding that even if you think you're doing the right thing, there's always people out there who will question that.
And the next question that comes up for people's mind is, if I acted out of good faith and I did the right thing and I even followed what I thought were the proper guidelines or proper procedures, which can be very challenging to do in a heat of a situation, and somebody takes legal action against me, well, after all, I have homeowners insurance and that should protect me from liability. True or false?
Yeah, mostly false. I wondered about that too. I will say that if people have any money whatsoever, they have some savings and those sorts of things, they should look into getting what's called an umbrella policy or a liability policy from normal companies like State Farm, Allstate, those kind of companies where you have your homeowners and car insurance. And I have an umbrella policy, and these are important for times like, somebody falls coming up your driveway, or, people get hurt on your property, or those kind of things where people could take your fortune from you quite quickly on just, some accident. So I called my insurance company, which was State Farm, and it just so happened that my agent is very good friends with somebody that had done vast amounts of research into Virginia law and the liability laws behind it in terms of self-defense shootings. And what they found out was that if you defend yourself, at least in the state of Virginia, under this liability policy, if you defended yourself and it was only a civil matter, so any criminal complaint had already been settled, either it was not filed or you had been tried and then found innocent, then your liability policy would come into play, and they would help pay for civil defense and civil damages. So that was good news. The bad news was that anything related to criminal was not covered. So, your bail, anything, your attorney trying to get you from going to jail, none of that was covered. And if you were convicted of any crime whatsoever, your liability policy was no longer valid for protecting you in a civil sense. So there were a lot of ways that they wouldn't help you if you ended up shooting someone. And it wasn't the main intent of the policy either. They have very specific clauses in there about intentional use of weapons. And by and large, normal homeowners insurance and those type of things are not meant to protect you from that. So my only caveat is I think there is some protection from umbrella policies like this, but only on the civil side and only in certain circumstances and only in certain states. So you'd really have to, get that in very clear with your agent first and understand what you're protected with.
Other types of coverage beyond your homeowner's insurance or an umbrella liability policy. I remember, again, at our CCW class, the last day when they were handing us out our graduation certificates, they also handed us a form that listed, it was the National Rifle Association, some membership sign-up form, and there was some legal protection option associated with that as well. I have to admit, we didn't. It's in the filing cabinet together with our permits. So I've got to ask you, what did you find out about other types of protection other than homeowners or umbrella liability policies that are available?
Yeah, so there's really 3 different types of self-defense insurance, and you can sort everybody into one of these 3 bins. There's legal service plans, which are really, it's like you're paying every year to have essentially access to attorneys. It's you sort of have a standing retainer with these self-defense attorneys all over the nation, and we can talk about specifics of different plans, but the idea of legal service plans is I'll pitch in my $150 a year as just sort of a retainer, and then if I'm ever brought under charges, you will provide me an attorney and any other services I need to have a good legal defense, and whether it be criminal and or civil, and we'll talk about the limitations of that. And on the criminal side, there's generally no limits to what that could cost. So if it costs $1 million for you to litigate that for my self-defense, as we go into court, then so be it. They take all of that cost on. And so that's the legal service plan. You just essentially pay a little retainer each year with the very slim chance, of course, that you're going to need it. But when you do, they're supposed to provide you attorneys at no cost. So that's the legal service plan. So the second one is, it's similar. It's called the Legal Defense Fund. And it's different. It's distinctly different in this way. Everybody, all the members, maybe there's 10,000 members, they pitch in their annual dues, and maybe it's, a couple $100 a year. Those dues are then collected into a pot. That's that fund, that legal fund. And should you get arrested for shooting someone, they will provide some of that money to you to pay your bail and to provide for your attorney retainer and so forth. And they will essentially act as the good faith agent to dole out the money of the expenses that might be needed. And there's some limits on that, and we'll talk about that too. But so that's the idea of this legal fund, is everybody's put their money in a pool, and if somebody needs it, then that money goes out and helps that member. There's some limitations on that, obviously, but it's an interesting idea, and there's a lot of high-profile people out there that you see in like some of the shooter magazines and stuff that are members of this. There's really only one major fund. They're members of the fund, and they'll advocate for it. And I'll talk to you about the pluses and minuses of it. But so that's the second one, which is a legal defense fund. And then the third one is more like our traditional insurance, like a State Farm or an Allstate. Now, those companies don't offer, at least today, they don't offer self-defense insurance. But there are other companies that do, and you mentioned the NRA, National Rifle Association. They do offer one. In fact, they're one of the two biggest players in the self-defense industry world right now. And these are real traditional insurance policies where I pay my annual dues, and they provide a certain level of benefit, whether it be $1 million of coverage or $500,000, which will help cover my attorney, my bail, maybe some civil defense, and maybe even civil damages. And they typically have other little benefits on these insurance plans too, like if your firearm is stolen, they usually will have a stolen firearm clause where they'll pay you for the cost of your firearm. Or if you had cleanup fees, I know it sounds weird, but I mean, you can imagine if you shoot somebody, there might be some cleanup required. Or if you had to do psychological counseling. Those traditional insurance plans oftentimes provide those supplementary benefits. And so that's the plus of them. The negative is, as we look through them, you'll see, is that they're more expensive than either the legal service plans or the legal defense funds. But so those are the three major types. And I would say if anybody's comparing them, no matter which website you go to and you're looking into them, see if you can, make sure you understand which of it is, because each one sort of has different benefits and drawbacks.
Of those different types, how many different commercial options do people have? I mean, how many players are in that field?
Yeah, so, you could probably dig really deep and find maybe 12 to 15, I would say, just going like even for these very small companies. But if you look at the major companies, the major players, there are really only 7. And there are, of those 7, 2 of them are legal service plans. Again, that's sort of like having an attorney on retainer all the time. One is a legal defense fund, and I couldn't find any other legal defense funds. There's only really one. It's called the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Fund. And then there are several that are insurance. The 4 main ones are NRA Carry Guard, which is the one probably you were exposed to. They've changed names a couple of times, but that's their official thing now, is the Carry Guard. Then there's USCCA, which is United States Concealed Carry Association. They have a product called the Shield. Those are the 2 biggest players in the entire industry. And then there's something called Second Call Defense and another one called CCA Advantage. And so a lot of the names are all sort of similar. If you search them, it's very easy to get confused about what. And I look at that one, but so you have to sort of sort through them and really line up their benefits and their trade-offs. That's what I did. I created a bunch of tables and compared all their pluses and minuses. But those are the 7 major players. And I'll just give you the high points. We don't want to walk down all the details of each of these 7, but the things to look for. So if you start with, let's just say, CCW Safe, okay, which is one of these legal service plans, all right? So the first thing you do is you look at the cost of this plan. Well, in this case, CCW Safe costs from $129 to $179 a year. All right, so you say, well, okay, that's $10 to $15 a month or something like that. You look next to see, does it provide for bail bonding? So you have to have, you're arrested, let's say, you're put into the hooskow, as it were, and you're given an opportunity to provide bail. Now, you only usually have to have a bail bondsman put up money, you usually have to provide 10% of the fee to that person. So if they're putting up $100,000 to get you out of jail, you have to give them $10,000 of real dollars for their risk of doing that, right? You might jump bail and disappear, and then they're out the money. So that's some money that has to go to them, $10,000, let's say, right? And so you would want to make sure that your insurance was willing, that was part of the plan, was to provide that funding to the bail bondsman. And, for example, in this CCW Safe plan, They will, in fact, depending on which policy you get, they either will provide no money or they'll provide all the way up to $100,000 to the bail bondsman, which is a lot of money. So again, that's the next item you would want to look at. I think that's some of these things are important and some aren't. That one I think is important because you're going to be under a huge bunch of stress, right? Your family everybody would be uncertain about what comes next. And you don't want to figure that out sitting in a jail cell. So I think having somebody, provide that money to help get you out would be important. The next thing is, do they provide the criminal attorney or do you get to pick your own criminal attorney? Now, most people would say, well, I want to pick my own, absolutely, because they're going to pick a joker that's not going to do a good job for me. There's a plus and minus on that, actually. I think I don't know who I'd pick, right? Would I go my yellow pages? How do you find a good firearm, self-defense attorney? So the question of who gets to pick is one of the features that you have to decide about when you pick a policy. These self-defense, these legal service plans in general, the ones that are these like the CCW Safe, they always pick the attorney. Now you might say, well, why? Well, that's not right. Well, they pick the attorney because they're on the hook for all of the cost, 100% of the cost. So you might think, oh, okay, well, so they want to make sure they're going to get an attorney who's going to properly represent you, who they can afford, who's going to be, legally certified and all the right things. So anyway, they get to pick it in this case. In other policies, you get to pick it, and they just provide the money for your attorney. So that's another consideration you have to decide. And then there's many times, like in the insurance plans, like CCW, like USCCA Shield or NRA Carry Guard, for example, both of those, the criminal attorney fees are often very limited. And it's, if you think about it, that's probably what you're most interested in protecting is your freedom and your finances of somebody taking you and trying to put you into prison. And if it costs you $250,000 to, go and litigate your case, even if you win, you're out $250,000, right? And so your whole life has sort of changed anyway. And so how much they're willing to pay on the criminal defense is super important. It's one reason I do like the legal service plans is because they essentially will pay it all. Now, with that said, if you get a good insurance policy like one like Shield or Carry Guard, they typically have pretty high numbers, usually around $250,000 you can get where they'll pay that much of a criminal attorney cost, and that's usually adequate. So that would be the next factor with the criminal attorney costs. And then it comes down to civil attorney costs and civil damages. The legal service plans in general will pay for the civil attorney again, which is great, but they won't pay anything for civil damages. So that's a big thing to know. If you go in and you buy a legal service plan where you've got this attorney on retainer, he's going to defend you, and I assume he's going to defend you to the best of his ability. But if you lose, and let's say you're doing civil litigation at the time, if you lose the civil litigation, you're on the hook for all of the damages with those kind of plans. They don't have to cost share with you. Whereas traditional insurance, you have some, maximum amount that they will pay for you. Maybe it's $1 million, $1.5 million. And so they take out the cost of the attorney and all the fees they've already paid, and then there's some bulk money left. And if a civil judgment is made against you, that money is used to help pay for that, maybe pay for all of it. And so that's a big plus of the traditional insurance plans, is even if I lose in civil court, this company is going to help me with these costs, right? The one caveat, and everybody that buys self-defense insurance should really understand this, all of that assumes that you're not found guilty of a crime. If you're convicted in criminal court, so let's say you're charged with manslaughter and you're convicted, you get no civil protections under any of these plans. They don't have to provide an attorney, and they don't have to provide any damages whatsoever. So it's only on the case of you're not charged with a crime, but you're charged in civil court, or you're charged with a crime and you're found innocent, and then you're brought in front of a civil court. These companies are still on the hook to help protect you. But it's real important everybody understand that. If you get convicted of a crime, they're off the hook. All that $1.5 million they waived to say, I'll help take care of you, is out the window. So that's really important to know that. So dollars is sort of that was the next one, was, how much money do they do? And then the other one I really think is important is whether or not it covers any legal weapon. Now, by that, we think firearms. Of course, if I'm in a fight for my life, I'm sure hope I have my firearm with me. But, on occasion, I don't have a firearm with me. And, what if I have to grab that butter knife or that pipe or whatever, my bare hands, and I end up killing somebody as in my self-defense? Some of these policies will not cover you for that. The NRA policy, for example, is really only about firearms and I think maybe bows and air guns. And so, it's meant for NRA-type things. So if you grab your butter knife and stab the guy in the eye and kill him, you perfectly in your right of self-defense, they do not provide any coverage for you. So I think it is important that while it's unlikely you might have to defend yourself with something other than your firearm, it's certainly possible. And so that's the one I think is sort of the last really important one, that you would want to look at when you're comparing these things. And there's a lot of secondary things like whether they pay for different types of things, whether your spouse is covered for free or an additional charge, or they have lots of things like that. But those are the ones I would say are most important when you compare these plans.
That was one of the things you mentioned is that you can be, and we talked about this briefly before, is that even when you had the absolute most innocent of intentions of I'm just trying to protect and preserve my life and that of my family and our health and our well-being here, you still potentially, depending on how things played out and depending on the way it's prosecuted and depending on the judge and depending on the jury or whatever, you could still possibly be found guilty of a crime that you had absolutely no intention of doing anything illegal.
Oh, right, absolutely, yeah. Unfortunately, it's not up to us to decide if we're guilty of the crime or not, right? I think we'd all conclude, no, what I did was justified, right? And we could make a great argument for that. And same way civilly, right? There are many cases, it's probably even worse in civil court, right, where a person's found not guilty of a crime because a reasonable jury of his peers said, no, what he did was reasonable, right? He defended his wife or himself, and we wouldn't put him in jail for what he did. But in front of a civil court, it's a little bit different hurdle. And now it's trying to answer the question, not what he did is, legally should we put him in jail over it, but it's now, well, what he did, was it reasonable and prudent, or should he be penalized in some way and reimburse this family for a loss? And people view that very differently when they're trying to decide judgments. And so even if you weren't convicted of a crime, you could be brought up in front of a civil court and end up owing a fortune to somebody who legally you had the right to shoot and kill, but maybe not in a civil court. The mother of this person's crying and saying how they can't get along in their life without this person. Next thing you know, you owe them $1 million to try and, recoup this family's loss. And either way, maybe you're not going to jail over it, but you still had your whole life disrupted by it. So yeah, even, for cases that you think are clear and you absolutely have the right to defend yourself, there's no telling exactly how all that plays out for you.
After all of your studies, you mentioned that there were some that emerged to the forefront for you, particularly based on some criteria that you thought were most important. Which were the ones that you ended up thinking people might want to consider taking the closest look at?
Yeah, so I'll compare two that are probably the two that most people would buy, that they go out and search it, and that's USCCA Shield and NRA's Carry Guard. So those are the two powerhouses, absolutely overwhelm the rest of the industry. And people, that was where I started, and I said, well, which of these two should I get? They look really similar. They got millions of dollars of coverage. Both of them are traditional insurance plans, but they're distinctly different. And I'll just point you to their differences, and then your audience can decide which they would rather. But so USCCA Shield is really a bit more above board, like you would think of an insurance. If I shoot someone, they're going to provide up to a certain amount of money for a criminal attorney for me, up to $250,000 if I bought that policy, let's say. And he's going to come and defend me. And then, assuming I'm not found guilty again, let's say I'm taken to civil court, they're going to provide, and I get to pick the attorney, they're just going to pay for him, this attorney for the civil court. He's going to come and defend me, and let's say we lose the civil case. There's a judgment against me for $1.5 million. I have a $2 million policy. We've only spent $400,000 in my defense. They will then pay that $1.5 million, whatever that cost is that they have to pay out as a civil judgment. So even though I lost the civil case, they end up paying my costs, and they end up paying my civil judgment against me. So it's very much a safety net, right? The only thing that really can go wrong, there's two things that could go wrong with it. One is you lose the criminal case, in which case you have no civil protection. That would be very unfortunate, and you're also probably going to jail. And the second is that you get such a tremendous civil judgment against you, maybe a $10 million judgment for some reason, that your policy only covers a couple $1 million, and $8 million against you and $10 million against you probably has the same net result, right? And so that's sort of the only drawback, is there's a limit to the amount that they will cover for you. But it's a very straightforward policy. There's never any reimbursement required. So if they paid $250,000 for a criminal attorney and then you were found guilty, you don't have to give them back a dime. They're out that money. Your attorney was, paid for, and you're sort of, at least that's not weighing on you, even if you do have to serve time for what you've done. So I like that. I like the straightforwardness of the USCCA Shield plan. Now, it's not cheap. It's about $500 a year for their best plan. So, it's definitely more expensive than, say, some of these legal service plans, which might be $150 a month or something. I mean, $150 a year or so. So $500 a year versus $150 a year, it's significantly more expensive. Now, the other one is the NRA Guard, and I'm a lifelong member of the NRA, so don't in any way think I'm bashing the NRA. And they do wonderful things for our rights, our civil liberties to be able to carry a firearm. I think their plan is a little bit shakier. Their cost is very similar. It's about $550 a year. One thing I didn't like about it is it's not for all weapons. It's only firearms, air guns, and bows. So again, in the unlikely event I stab someone to death, they're not going to help me out. So that's one. And the second thing is really what bugs me, is that they only provide 20% up front. And so the idea is if I go and I get an attorney and I pay him, I have a $50,000 retainer just to get me going, right? They're going to pay 20% of that. They're going to pay $10,000. I have to come up with the other 40. And they do that basically through the phases as you go through this criminal defense. Their skin in the game is 20%, and your skin in the game is 80%. And so if you win the criminal case, they will then pay those costs, all of them. They'll reimburse you up to their limit of $250,000. They'll reimburse those costs. But it just kind of irks me that, they don't have all the skin in the game, right? If it goes south on me, all they're out is their 20%. I'm out all the rest, and I paid them my good hard-earned money to cover me. That kind of bothers me. They have a similar sort of thing in terms of civil, but they're slightly better than the USCCA in civil. They will pay for the civil litigation completely, no matter how much it costs. Could cost $10 million if that were the case. It wouldn't matter. It doesn't come out of your total. So they are basically on the hook to pay for all civil litigation. Now, they're going to pick the attorney, as you can imagine, and the reason they do that is because it's in their best interest. They're liable for up to $1.5 million of your civil damages. And so they don't want to lose that case, and they're going to pay whatever they need to win that case. And so that's good for you, too. And the good thing is it doesn't come out of your settlement. If you were on, you bought $1.5 million of coverage, you still have $1.5 million when you get done to pay for the civil damages. And so as I wrote NRA and asked them about their differences, and this is the way they explained it to me. And so that's a good thing. The advantage of them is they pay all of your civil litigation costs, and it doesn't come out of your total. That's the plus there. So those are the two major policies. One of them, like I said, the USCCA seems more like, straightforward meat and potatoes. I kind of get it. This one's a little bit dicier because it's only 20% in for the criminal part. But then it's really a little bit better, to be frank, in terms of the civil part. And so cost-wise, they're almost identical, $500-ish a year. And so I think each person would just have to go in and look at those and decide, which they were more comfortable with if they're going to pick one of those two. So those are the two big players, and I will say right up front, I didn't buy either one of them. I liked them both. I was torn by it. I probably would have bought the USCCA Shield only because I thought it was a little more straightforward and easy to understand, but I didn't. I didn't buy it. I ended up going with CCW Safe, which is one of the legal service plans. It's a lot cheaper. It's like $170 a year, and it provided all of my criminal costs, but none of my civil damages. And I already have a liability umbrella policy, which at least hopefully, I'm keeping my fingers crossed, would help me cover the civil damages if that were the case. So I kind of went that route, a little bit cheaper route. But I do think, either this USCCA Shield or the NRA Carry Guard are both very good policies. And if you wanted something a little bit cheaper, maybe the CCW Safe like I've got, or that Armed Citizens Legal Defense Fund, it's also kind of comparable. I think those are all good options. There's some others out there. I don't think they're quite as good. So those would be the ones I'd sort of look at first.
So any parting comments from you about defending yourself with a firearm for people who are, because this can be really sobering. You go through all these scenarios and you realize, holy smokes, I mean, I think it really is eye-opening for people. First of all, most people live kind of in this bubble of denial of, oh, nothing's going to happen to me. And then once people get past that, they go, well, I guess something could happen to me and I better get prepared. So then they get a weapon and they get training and then they get a CCW permit and all this. But then when you get all that, you realize, holy smokes, there's more to be concerned about than just a perpetrator. There's this whole legal consideration. So what are some real important considerations for people about defending themselves with a firearm?
Sure, yeah. So I wanted to share just a handful of tips that I got from a firearm instructor, John Murphy, and this was at his firearm training camp. And there are things that stuck with me. I mean, he taught lots of things, but there were sort of these 5 things that I took away and I wrote down. I even put them in one of my books with his permission and said, these are things I think are valuable nuggets to keep with you if you're going to carry a gun. And so I'll share them with you, and they're all obvious. So the first one was, during our training, it was always watch the perpetrator's hands, right? So we get so caught up in people's eyes and their faces and their threatening gestures. And his point was always this: hands hold weapons, weapons kill people. So if you want to know what a person's intending you, watch his hands, right? And so if a person's hands are out of sight, it means it's very likely he has a weapon hidden behind him or something like that. So his whole thing was watch his hands. If someone's approaching you and you perceive them to be a threat, watch his hands. So that's the first one. And it seems obvious, it's silly even, but it might keep you from getting blindsided by something. The second one was, if there's one perpetrator, there's 2 perpetrators. And his argument for that was, you face off with an opponent, and many times these people out doing, evil against others are not by themselves, right? They have some cohort in with it, maybe a gang of them. And so his mindset was, if I see one threat, I'm always going to assume there's another one out of my sight, around the corner, waiting, to step into the wings. So you never, put away your firearm and relax and get yourself in a position where you can't defend yourself until you've cleared all of the threats that are in the area. And so his motto was, if there's one, there's 2. And I think it's a reasonable set. And you see a lot of this in training. You always see people engage a target, they shoot the target, and then they always look left and they look right. And that's supposed to bring that mindset of, I don't know that I've finished with the fight yet, right? And so that idea, if there's one, there's 2, I think that's a good mindset to go into a fight with. The third one is, if he's carrying a rifle, you have to assume that he's wearing body armor. And there were a few cases where our instructor shared that with us, including a video that was very sobering, where a guy went to a police station with a rifle and shot up the police station from out in the parking lot. Suicide by policemen, right? But so he's shooting up the police station, and one of the cops manages to come out from his cruiser and comes up behind this guy and shoots him in the back. Bang, bang, bang. And the guy turns around with a rifle and kills the cop. All this on camera, right? And the lesson was that, this guy had gone to the trouble to get his weapon, get all these extra magazines and all this other stuff. It's a pretty good bet that he went to the trouble to put on some body armor too. And this cop, in the height of the battle, didn't think that through, put 3 in his middle of his back. It wasn't enough to drop the guy, and ended up paying with it for his life. And so the instructor's comment was, if he's carrying a rifle, assume that he's wearing body armor and shoot him in the head or shoot him in the groin. Think alternate targets of what then your main sort of center body targets. And I think that's good advice. I mean, it's something certainly to keep in your mind. The fourth one is probably maybe the most important of all, or the second most important maybe, is that we live in a world of cameras, right? Everywhere we go, there are cameras on buildings and ATMs in people's hands. Everybody's got a camera on their phone, on their cars. So it's very rare that a shooting would occur that there wouldn't be some kind of video showing what happened. And it might not show it in great clarity, but it would certainly show what happened. And so his comment was that since you're almost always on camera, you should act accordingly. And so the idea is, if you pull a firearm or you engage in some kind of self-defense situation, you should assume that you're on camera and that everything you do is going to be watched very, very carefully by a jury. And so, now's not the time to play Billy Badass and act the fool. Now's the time to be cool, calm, and collected and very careful with what you do, so that your actions, when they're reviewed later, are viewed as the reactions of a rational, sane person just trying to defend himself or his family. And so, it's easy when you get in the height of anger to do or say things that are not in your normal character. And a good example of this was in that class, one of those classes I went to, was where a shop owner was robbed by a young man, came in and robbed him and hit him in the head with this weapon, sort of pistol whipped him in the head and was very violent with this guy, right? And so the guy's starting to rob him. Well, little does he know, the shop guy has got a shotgun under the counter. And so as the guy turns to leave, he grabs that shotgun and pops up on top of the counter and shoots the guy. Fine, all good, right? And so the guy falls in front of the counter. And the guy who had been hit with the pistol was so angry over what had happened. He wasn't able to stop his anger. He leaned over the counter and shot the guy at point-blank range with the shotgun a second time, and ended up being convicted of, I don't know if it was manslaughter or murder, for this guy on the ground. Again, all captured on his own camera in his store because he had gone beyond a certain point that was considered reasonable for self-defense. So that point only is consider yourself on camera at all times in what you do, because they're very likely you are. And then the final one, I think, is probably the most relevant to this discussion, which is, when the police arrive, the way my instructor always said it is keep your mouth shut. And that seems so counterintuitive. You would think these policemen are just here to find out what happened, and they're going to be on my side, and I did the right thing anyway. They just need to take my statement. That's their job, right? And I don't want to get arrested for not talking to them. All of those things go through your mind. But I have spoken with numerous people, including some attorneys who work in this area, and they all say the same thing. Do not give a statement other than I was in fear for my life, and I'd really like a chance to calm down and say anything else, right? That's it. I was in fear for my life, and I'd really like a chance to calm down before I say anything else. Now, you might think they're going to think you got something to hide, and they might arrest you. And all that's true. It could be. Could be they slap the cuffs on you and they take you down to jail. But the reality of it is policemen are given the same benefit. If a policeman is involved in a shooting, they're always given an opportunity to have an attorney present when they make their statement, because they want to make sure it's carefully drafted, that they don't say something incorrect, and that they think through everything that happened. They don't sort of speak out of hand. And so they are given that benefit. It's only right that you be given the same benefit. And so that's the best advice probably anybody could have, is if you're involved in a shooting, you keep it very simple and to the point. Even if you're arrested because you feel like, oh, well, they're going to arrest me if I don't. Don't go into the details. Well, he came in and I felt like I had to go for this, and then I shot him once, but he didn't seem like he was, don't go. None of that is the time to have that conversation. That conversation is had between you and your attorney first, and then you draft up a statement that makes the most sense to give you the strongest case, and then it's presented to the police as your official statement. So, that's the best advice I think anybody could have. It's just a hard piece of advice, I think, to follow in the real world.
If people, this is a lot of information you shared with us, even though people can rewind and listen to some of this. You mentioned that there's more details and some of that financial analysis you went through earlier. Where can people go for all the details, Arthur?
So I didn't want to walk through all the boring details of each of these insurance policies. So they can go to my website, disasterpreparer.com, and there's a little link on there to sign up for a free newsletter. And I don't bombard people with junk mail of any sort. I maybe send a newsletter every 6 months. But those newsletters, there's a little link in it that takes you to a shared drive that I keep all my free preparedness information out on the shared drive. And this presentation that I do for self-defense insurance, all of the numbers and stuff are in that presentation. They can get it for free. So just go to my website, disasterpreparer.com, look for the free newsletter, and click on that, and then you can get a link to that shared drive.
Well, that's a lot of information, and we really appreciate it. Folks, we've been talking with Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, Ph.D. He is the founder and host of disasterpreparer.com, author of numerous books about disaster survival and aftermath of disaster. He's been talking with us today about protecting yourself from the risk that happens after a self-defense event. Dr. Bradley, thank you so much for joining us, as always, here on Reluctant Preppers.
Yeah, thank you for having me.